Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another Adobe XD Masterclass. My name is Howard Pinsky, Senior XD Evangelist here at Adobe. Hope you're all doing well on this Friday afternoon. If you are tuning in live here on Behance, let me know in the chat who you are and where you're tuning in from. We've got Laura and Wade and Mwenda and Eric, Fiona, Umacorn. Great to see familiar faces and new faces. And if you're tuning in for the first time, welcome. Can't wait to have you and show you all the goodies that Adobe XD brings. Hey, Tim, great to see you as well. All right, let's go ahead and hop over my screen. We're gonna get going with Masterclass number 107. We've been at this for 107 weeks. What are we gonna be designing today? Well, if you follow me on Twitter or Dribble or Instagram, you may have seen I've been working on a boarding pass. And I kind of got this idea when I finally traveled not too long ago. It was just about 2 weeks ago. Traveled to San Francisco and San Jose for a work offsite, and I got inspired. So I created this boarding pass, and I think it's a lot of fun. It's very colorful. It's a little bit different than what you typically see in many of these travel applications that are out there. United, American Airline, Frontier, all these different, they're kind of boring, honestly. So I want to have a little bit of fun with this design, add some color, give it a little bit of a skeuomorphic feel, with this kind of ticket over here. That's what we're going to be designing today. And as a reminder, if anyone has questions throughout this stream, throw them in the chat. Obviously, news has happened over the course of the week. I won't be touching too much on the news for obvious reasons. This probably isn't there we go. Martin mentioned it. There'll be a time and place to talk about some of that stuff. But during the masterclasses, we're going to dive deep into designing. So I'm going to hop over to Adobe XD, and considering this particular design is focused on mobile, I'm going to go ahead and choose a mobile preset. So we have the iPhone 13, 12 Pro Max, and of course, I think today actually, the new iPhone 14 and 14 Pro are coming out with the dynamic island, which we might talk about a little bit. So I'm gonna go ahead and open up this artboard and we're gonna dive in. So I'm gonna name this artboard, let's say boarding pass, and let's go. So one thing that I really liked about board pass, I can't even spell. See, this is the problem when you're streaming. You just don't even think properly. So one of the things I really loved about the design that I created for this boarding pass is that it had a nice pop of color. But of course, you want to be careful when you're adding pops of color because you don't want to distract from the main content. That's kind of why there was a separation there. If you remember here, we have a nice pop of color up top, but where the actual boarding pass is, there's a darker background, which creates a nice amount of contrast back there, right? So what I'm going to do to start is we're going to set our artboard color, which is going to allow us to have that header right here at the top. So over within the properties inspector, I'm going to pop open the fill and we're going to change this to Beverly saying I get my 14 Pro Max tomorrow. That's exciting. I think mine's coming in today. My wife's, she's going to kill me for that. She's not happy. I mean, she's fine, but her phone is actually going to a different state, a state we used to live in. We rushed through the pre-order and I was just doing, continue, didn't check the address, and it's going to a completely different state, and it's apparently out for delivery. I don't know what's going to happen to it, but we'll see, right? All right, so we've got our nice pop of color, but of course we don't want this entire thing to be a pop of color. So we want down at the bottom, we want an area that is a little bit darker and allows for that contrast. So I'm going to grab my rectangle tool, shortcut key R, and view all the way down to the bottom, just like that. Sam is saying, I have to hear your reaction about the Figma Adobe thing. I'm not going to give too much of a reaction right now. Overall, I'm very excited, but I know there's a lot of concern in the community, rightfully so. I totally get it, but I'm very excited. Thinking about the future of design and knowing that Figma is going to remain autonomous, so they're going to do their own thing. Pricing's not going to change. Figma's amazing, obviously, but there'll be a time and place. I might hop on a Twitter space next week with Dan Petty, possibly. I'm working with my legal team and PR team just to make sure I can, say certain things because there's a lot of legalities involved in things like this. So time and place, probably not right now though. All right, 16. Following that good old 8-pixel grid, we're going to round out the corners a little bit. Now, we don't want the corners at the bottom to be rounded out because that just looks a bit strange, right? So we can hold down our Alt or Option key and drag on back, or you can also hop into the properties inspector over to the right and adjust the corner radius here as well. Beverly says, hope you have your forwarding address on. So I've been talking with Apple and UPS to try to figure that whole thing out. It just didn't happen. They wouldn't let me change the address. Apple said they submitted a request a few times. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen with that phone. Who knows? All right. So we have this section down here. Now we could leave it white and then create darker elements on top of it, or we can create a darker element up here. And I think that could be interesting. So we're going to set the fill, and maybe we're going to do a bit of a linear gradient, just so we have a very subtle gradient on this particular element up here. So maybe we'll do something like, and I'm going to add a little bit of maybe blue or purple. Maybe at the top it's going to be slightly lighter, and then down at the bottom it's going to be quite a bit darker, right? Somewhere in that range there. You want to be very careful with your gradients that they're not too drastic. You know, if I were to do something like this, it's just, not only is it an eyesore, but it's also going to make it very difficult to place elements on top of that because of accessibility and contrast and all that fun stuff, right? So we want to keep it nice and subtle, just like that. We might go back and make some changes. All right, we're going to get back to this section here, but let's start at the top, and we're going to want to add some information specifically to let users know where they're flying, which is kind of important, right? Someone's saying, please don't increase the pricing and add repeat grids to Figma. So pricing, you know, Dylan confirmed on his blog that pricing is not changing, which is great. And he confirmed during his Twitter space today that the free plan for Figma is not going away, which is wonderful. As for features, we just can't talk about that. At least I can't. Legal things and just nothing. So the time will come when the acquisition closes. I'd love to have that conversation, but at the moment, not happening. All right, so right here at the top, you know, about 45 pixels or so down, somewhere in this range here, at the moment, for most people, you've got the notch, right? In the future, starting today, you have the dynamic island, which, what a name, right? But it's you know, it's something somewhere about here, it's rounded. And I'm gonna definitely do a masterclass on, but it's, you know, it's about that you have to tap on. Now, down below, we might want to set the stage and let users know that this is the boarding pass. So I'm going to type out boarding pass. Now, obviously, this text choice is just not going to work, right? This gray on purple, not happening. So we're going to first switch it over to white, and then we're going to work on the text. Now, we could, you know, use fancy text up here, but we're going to keep it fairly simple. We're going to do something like San Francisco, maybe the UI text, and that's going to be the one directly from Apple. I'm going to center it. Maybe we will bump up the... Okay, I rebooted the stream, and hopefully we're back. So I'm going to continue, and I'm going to go ahead and place this somewhere in this area here. It does look a little bit too large. I'm going to launch my preview. It's not terrible, but, you know, we'll leave it at that for now. I might also want to shift the color a little bit of the background. Somewhere in this range here. All good now. Sweet. See? Turn it off and back on again, and you're all good. All right. Now, down below here, we may want in nice large text, maybe where you're going or where you're coming from, where you're departing, and then where you are heading to. So in this example, we're going to do something like LAX, right? And we can make this nice and large. And I think this is an opportunity to get a little bit fancier with our text, right? So we have our San Francisco UI typeface selected right now, but I'm going to choose something like Glaster. And I believe I licensed this typeface from UI 8. And I think it's a fun looking typeface, right? Now, if you are looking for fonts that you can use in your projects, I would definitely head over to Adobe Fonts, fonts.adobe.com. And what's really cool about this is you can hop into the All Fonts section, and then over on the left-hand side, right over here, you can choose something like Luxury, right? And you can add a preview at the top, some LAX, and you can just browse through this, and you can just sync it. It's going to pop open in, you know, it's going to be available in XD or any of your other Creative Cloud applications, and you'll be able to use it. Something like this is kind of nice, and it might work for a project like this. But you have to keep in mind that these display typefaces, especially on the luxurious side, they look nice when they're very large, but when you shrink them down, they become very difficult to read, right? So definitely keep that in mind. So we might do LAX on one side, and then maybe we're going to SFO, right? San Francisco on the other side. Now we want to make sure that it's not just one big block of text, because then someone's going to look at this and be like, LAX FFO, like what exactly is that, right? So we're going to separate this a little bit, and you might see in boarding passes there might be an arrow, or there might be some sort of separator, right? And Martin, I'm going to get to your question in just a moment, but I'm going to hop over to Nucleo, which I've been using quite often in my master classes. It's a third-party icon manager, and we'll type out something like plain, right? And we have this icon here from Font Awesome. I'm going to copy it and paste it. I'm going to make it nice and small. Maybe I'll line it up with the bottom of our text, and I can, drag out some guides just to make sure that it does line up. Change the color to white. And we'll leave it somewhere right about there. And now that I have that plane kind of in place, which I might want to make sure to center, now I can adjust the size of the text a little bit. Right? Something like this. There we go. All right, so Martin did ask a question about Adobe fonts in actual development. So let me actually hop over to Safari one more time. So let's say you're browsing these typefaces and you find one that you really like. Now, these luxurious ones may not make too much sense on a web environment, although you probably could if you have a nice large header. But if you hop into one of the typefaces, you can activate the fonts over here. And that'll obviously sync to your Creative Cloud projects. But right down here at the bottom, you can add to a web project. So you can add a bunch of typefaces to your web project. It's going to give you a line of code. I think it's just literally a single line of code. You pop into the headers of your HTML, and you'll be able to then use those fonts and typefaces inside of your projects. Now, of course, keep in mind, the more typefaces you add to a web project, it might potentially slow things down a little bit. You're going to obviously have to add a lot of them to really slow it down. But many of the typefaces on Adobe fonts are available to use on the web. I don't think all of them are, but the vast majority that I've come across. Let's check this one over here. Yep, you can add it to your web project. So most, if not all, are available to add to a web project. So that's how you would do it. So you can use it in XD, Photoshop, Illustrator, but you can also use it on the web as well. All right, so we have our header looking pretty good. Now, there may be times where somebody may come across this page and they'll look at this and they'll say, okay, LAX, SFO, where am I going, right? They might not know. And I mean, you should know where you're going if you're hopping on a plane, but there's a possibility, right? So to help users out, maybe right underneath, we might want to add one more line of text for LAX and SFO, just to let them know what exactly these places are. So we're going to do Los Angeles. And this goes back to what I was talking about earlier. If we make this nice and small, somewhere maybe around, let's try 16, right? And we will left align it and pop it there. Now, when I'm zoomed in, it looks okay. But when I launch the preview at the top right-hand corner, those display luxurious typefaces, they all of a sudden become a little bit difficult to see. And I can dive in here and maybe, increase the character spacing, and it helps a touch. It's just still, it's not there, right? So I think for something like this, we're gonna kind of default back to a more traditional typeface. And there's a lot that I've been using lately, things like Astoria or Astoria Sans. Of course, you can keep it simple and stick with the San Francisco typeface, or Apple has their New York typeface now. If you're developing for Android, things like Roboto is a great typeface. Or you can switch it up a little bit and do something like Brandon Grotesque, which is a wonderful, strange name for a typeface. I think I'm pronouncing that grotesque, yeah. It's from Adobe Fonts, but I'm gonna go ahead and maybe bump this up to medium, and we might want to set this to all caps, just so it's a little bit easier to read. It stands out a little bit more. So I'm gonna press that button right there, and now we have a text layer right underneath. It says Los Angeles, and it is quite a bit easier to read than the previous typeface that I had selected, right? I'm gonna duplicate this over on this side, And this will be San Francisco. There we go. It's a great city, right? All right, that looks pretty good. So we have our header, and I'm gonna make sure to select all this information, group it, Command and Control G, and call this header. Beautiful. Now we can also probably add some additional elements up top, maybe a back button if there isn't a screen, or if there is a screen before this. Possibly on this side over here to the right, you can add maybe a save button or a print button. People still print things. Usman is saying, I was expecting today's stream was supposed to have Figma. No, not yet. We still have to wait for the acquisition to close, which might be a year from now, potentially even more. There's a long process ahead. Government has to do its thing. And until then, XD. When the time comes, we'll talk. We'll see what happens. All right. That's looking pretty good. Now, down here, we want to get to the meat of this particular screen, and that's going to be the boarding pass. So I think it'd be kind of fun to add a little bit of depth to this, right? So at the top here, we might want maybe a rectangle that kind of goes across here, something like this, and this might be rounded, just like that. Beverly's asking, has anyone used the Apple icon library? Yes. So let me actually SF symbol. I think I have it here. I have a beta. I think it's probably out of beta now. This is the new symbols that were added. I think there was a conflict. Last time I tried to use it, there was some sort of font conflict where if I copied it or I pasted it, yes. Oh, actually, maybe it fixed. There we go. It fixed itself. Yeah, last time I used it on stream, there was some sort of weird conflict and it just gave me some error message, but it seems to have been fixed. But it's a great way to get some official Apple icons like this portrait or arrow down or whatever it might be into your projects. All right. Samuel says, correct me if I'm wrong, but the dynamic island has to be one of the greatest design experiences added in a long time. I'm very excited to try it out. It's such a weird thing because Apple took a feature and an element that for the most part bothered people. It was this notch at the top. It's like, ugh, it's ugly, it's there, it's boring and gets in the way sometimes. And they turned it into a feature. It blew my mind when I first saw it. Obviously, it would be nice to just not have anything up there, but until those hardware limitations are dealt with, I think it's a brilliant solution from Apple. So good job, anyone from Apple who might be watching, great job. All right, so up here, what we might want is to make it look like there's a bit of a hole. You know, the ticket's gonna kind of come out of it, right? So we're gonna do, maybe we'll drop the color so that it's a lot darker, something like that. And I think what's gonna really sell it, there might be two things. One might be an inner shadow, right? So we can add an inner shadow down here at the bottom, make this purely, I think I selected the wrong object. Good job, Howard. This object. Add an inner shadow, make it black, bump up the Y a little bit. Maybe I'll increase the opacity a touch, so there's a little bit of a shadow up there. And then at the bottom, we might want to add a slight highlight, which can actually be done using a drop shadow. So if I switch over to drop shadow, I'm going to switch the color over to white, and we're going to grab the blur and probably take it down to maybe 0. And then the Y, we're going to bump it to about 1, and then maybe experiment with the opacity a little bit. Now up close, it looks a little bit strange, but when you start zooming out, that simple addition of a very simple drop shadow at the bottom kind of adds this nice little highlight that makes it look like there's a bit of an indent there. Could use a little bit of work, but I think it's going to work. All right. Next, right on top of this, we're going to want the ticket that's going to protrude out of this particular indent. So I'm going to grab my rectangle tool one more time, and I say this a lot. Basically everything in design can be made with the rectangle tool, right? It's one of the greatest tools ever in design. So I'm going to draw one out. I'm not too worried about the size of this because we can either use padding and stacks to automatically resize it, or we can resize it a little bit later. And what I'm thinking is we might want to get a little bit fancy, right? At the top, it may not be too fancy. So I'm going to actually duplicate this, and maybe we'll channel our lovely pop of color up here, right? This might be the header of the ticket. And maybe to give the impression that it's kind of curving in and going into that indent, we may want to adjust I'm going to move this down for a second. We may want to adjust the corner radius, but also add a bit of a gradient, right? So for the corner radius, we only want it at the top left and the top right. So I'm going to go ahead and maybe 4 could look pretty good. So 4 and 4, and then 0 and 0 for the bottom. But we do want a bit of a gradient, and that'll give the impression that it's kind of being curved and folded in, if that makes any sense. So I'm going to switch over to a linear gradient. And what I really want is right up here at the top, we're going to have a few different colors. So the first one, I'm going to add maybe one over here and then maybe one here as well. The first one is going to be on the darker side. So if I have this main color selected, right, I might want to bring this down. And that'll give the impression that it's going into this indent, right? But then at some point when this ticket is coming out, it's going to curve, right? It's hard to demonstrate on video, but it's going to curve. And when that curve happens, there's naturally going to be a bit of a highlight right at that curve point because it's a little bit further out than everything else, which is kind of coming down, right? So this point right here, if I sample this color again, might be a little bit lighter, right? And then it's going to kind of transition back to that main color that we were using, right? Something like this. And again, similar to some of the other elements, it doesn't look great up close, but when you launch the preview, all of a sudden you have a nice curve at the top, right? So it almost looks a little bit 3D, which is kind of fun. All right. Usman is saying, so XD unable to have dark mode, resulting in acquiring Figma. You know, that could be the main reason. It's not, by the way. But that's funny. I appreciate that. All right, so I'm going to make a few little tweaks to this just to really emphasize that curve. There we go. And that looks pretty good. It's amazing what a very subtle gradient can do for this. And Umacorn saying, ooh, curvy. Yeah, isn't that cool? Very nice. All right, we're going to add some elements up here in just a second. But what I want to also do is this ticket here, I might want to make it look like a ticket. And if you look up a stamp or a ticket or something to that effect, you might know that there's a perforation on the bottom. There's also some cutouts. So let's add, maybe over here on this side, there might be. I'm not too worried about the color at the moment. But just so I can see it, I'm going to add here. These might be a little bit too large too. Maybe I'll drop them in size a touch. And then maybe we'll have 2 more down here at the bottom. And the nice thing is once we actually create a Boolean object, this is all going to be non-destructive. So we're going to be very easily be able to dive into this and make some changes. So just to kind of show you where we're going to head with this, we're going to select all of these, right? We're also going to select the shape in the background. And then right here at the top, we're basically going to use the subtract Boolean object to cut a hole in it. But what we also want to do is we want to have right at the bottom that perforation. So it's going to look like it's been ripped or, you know, cut or something like that. So how do we do that? Well, there are a few ways we can do that. We can grab our ellipse tool, right? And we can use a repeat grid all the way across. And we can maybe have a little bit of overlapping and do something like that, right? And we can use this in addition. Look at that. Magic, right? And what's so cool about this is we can also dive into the repeat grid and make some changes. And you can also do this with a line, for example. So if I grab a line and draw out a line like this, maybe I will change the color to white just so you can see it and bump up the size. I'm going to switch over the caps to round, which is very important in this case. And then I'm going to increase the dashes and the gaps, right? Maybe I'll drop the dashes, increase the gaps. So you have something very similar. And then what you would do is you would outline this stroke so you can use it for that Boolean object. But I think in this case, the repeat grid is going to work really well. So we have this repeat grid. We also have our holes over here to the right. So I'm going to make sure to select all of them. So I have all the 4 circles and also the repeat grid at the bottom. I'm going to make sure to select that shape in the background. I'm just holding down my shift key and clicking on all of this stuff. And then, boop, there we go. And again, like I mentioned, if I hop over here to my Boolean object, it's all non-destructive. So all the layers are still there. So here's the repeat grid, which I'm going to call perforation. I probably did not spell that correctly. How do you spell perforation? Perforation. I don't know. Is that right? Probably not, right? But again, it's in a repeat grid. So I can always dive in here, make some changes, right? And if I pop open the preview, I can make changes while I'm looking at the preview. think something like that could work. Maybe I can move the repeat grid up or down, maybe over to the side a little bit. I'm going to definitely have to hop over here and extend it a touch. But that looks pretty good. All of a sudden we have this object that, oh, did I get it right, Beverly? Thank you. Spelling is never my, especially when I'm streaming, I just don't, I mean, all of you know, it's just never good. All right, so we have our ticket. And again, non-destructive, you can dive in there, you can make it longer if you want to. Now, one thing I'm gonna note is you're noticing right now, some of these objects are getting stretched out. And if I hop into, maybe I'll select all of these ellipses, I just wanna make sure that under responsive resize, fixed width and fixed height is turned on. That way they're not getting squished and pulled and all that stuff. So as I resize this, they remain the same size, they just move with the ticket, which is wonderful. All right, so we have our ticket. Now we're definitely gonna have to make it longer at some point, but for now, let's start adding some content to our ticket. Now, over here to the left, we might wanna use this area to maybe highlight the airline that you're flying on, right? And what better way to bring in an airline than to bring in the Boop branding, right? So I'm gonna hop over to my Creative Cloud libraries and I'm going to choose, where is it? It's here somewhere, Boop branding. So let's go ahead and bring in maybe the Boop. I have a Boop long and a Boop short. I love the fact that I've just been incorporating Boop into basically everything. It's like my brand now, right? I'm gonna make this nice and small, somewhere up in this area here. Might still be too large. I mean, it's not too bad. That's one thing I love about the preview window, is you can just kind of have it there on another screen or even on your phone and just design away and it just updates. You can kind of get a better perspective of how things are looking. But that looks pretty good right about there. You know what, let's see what the long logo looks like. Maybe the long one's nicer. I mean, they're both not bad. But let's go with the long. Pop this somewhere here. And then we want to bring in some sort of an airplane into this, right? So I'm going to hop back over to Nucleo. And let's select this bit of an airplane right here. It's the end of an airplane. I'm going to copy that. And paste. Woo, that's large. Those font awesome icons are very large. Maybe I'll flip it around. And then we'll position it somewhere in this area here. I mean, it will change the color to white. Now, we do want to make sure that there's a little bit of a cutout here, right? So I'm going to maybe grab an ellipse. I can pop it somewhere in this area here. Make sure this is behind, or I can also use that as a boolean object, but I think that could work. I think that could work. All right. Can we use your Boop logo in our projects? That's a good question, actually. I mean, maybe. I haven't copyrighted it or trademarked it or anything like that. Maybe I'll make it available at some point so you can all do Boop things. Just don't pretend that you're me when you're uploading Boop projects, but if you want to just have some fun with it, why not, right? All right, so we have our Boop logo over here, which I'm going to make sure to group and call this logo. And then over to the right, we might just want to have a single line of text that might display maybe the flight number, for example. So it might be BA for Boop Airlines. Why not, right? And then some random numbers. Whoops. One password. No. All right. And pop that over here. 16. Maybe I'll bump it up to about 18. I'm going to right align it so it's easy to update. And there we go. Let's set it around 24 pixels from the right. And make sure this is also about 24 pixels, and that looks pretty good. All right, so we have our header looking decent. Now I might end up making this a little bit smaller. We're gonna see how things end up looking as we go. This header might be a little bit too large. It might be a bit unnecessary, right? But we'll see. Now, down below, this is really where the bulk of the information is going to come in. We're going to have things like your departing time, your arrival time, how long the flight is, maybe your gate number, boarding pass, seat number, Maybe things that are on the plane. Is there Wi-Fi on the plane? Super important, right? And then maybe a barcode or a QR code at the bottom so that you can very easily scan it when you are boarding. Things that are very important on a ticket, on our boarding pass, right? So we're going to start with maybe the top section, which is going to be your departure time and arrival time. So we're going to start, let's say, with, and we're going to make sure that we can see it. Very important, right? We'll do something like 8:50, and this will be, we definitely want to make sure that people know that it's in the morning, right? That'd be very awkward to get to the airport and no flight, right? All right, so we're about 8:50, and maybe we'll bump this up a little bit just so that's really visible, maybe medium, or 22, maybe bold possibly. So we have 8:50, and then right down below, we may want to indicate where you're departing from, even though we have it up here, right? It's always good if you can make it fit and not cram everything together. It's always good to have more information, especially for things like this. You don't want people going to the wrong airport, right? So we'll do something like Los Angeles. And I'm going to make this quite a bit smaller, somewhere around maybe 14. I might want to bump down the weight. Beverly says Wi-Fi should be free on all flights. I wish it could. I mean, it's kind of a luxury right now, and I know there's technology and satellites and all these different things involved, but I think we're going to get there eventually, especially when maybe Starlink and other similar satellites start integrating onto planes. Hopefully, we'll see more free. I know the flight that I was just on, I think it was a United flight. They at least offered free Wi-Fi for text messaging. So you can, message your spouse or your friends or whatever while you're in the air, which was nice. But everything else is, paid. I think it was like $8, which isn't too bad, right? It's not the end of the world, but it would be nice if it was more accessible, especially if you're working up there and things like that. All right, so we have our departing time. I'm going to group and time departing. And then I'm going to duplicate this over to this side here. And this is going to be our arrival time. So I'm going to switch this over to arrival. And then maybe we will change this to say, I don't know how long it takes, maybe like an hour and a bit. And then this is going to be San Francisco. Did I spell that right? I don't think I did. Maybe I did. I always spell San Francisco incorrectly. There we go. That looks pretty good. And then in the middle, we may want some sort of indication that you're traveling from Los Angeles to San Francisco. Because, it may be very apparent to you that Los Angeles is the place you're departing from and San Francisco is the place you are arriving at. But to some people, it may not be. And these are things you have to kind of think about as you're designing. So maybe in the middle, we might want an airplane. One more airplane, right? Copy this, paste. So far, we have 3 different airplanes in this project. We have this guy here, we have the back of an airplane, and we have one taking off. Although, thinking about it now, it probably makes sense to have this one down here because you're taking off, right? More things to think about. Design is fun. All right, so I'm going to place this maybe right about here. And then we might want maybe some sort of dots of some sort, right? Just to kind of connect these 2 destinations. So maybe we'll start with maybe a very simple ellipse on this side. And then we'll add maybe a line going across, same color. And then we're gonna maybe increase the dashes. Something like that, right? That could work. Maybe I'll increase the size a little bit. Is that too much? Although it's not bad. Maybe I'll bring this down a little bit. Move this over, and then I can duplicate and then flip. There we go. Renee says, I'm late, but hey, Pinksy. Renee, you spelled it incorrectly. It's funny, a lot of people, my wife spelled our last name incorrectly for like the first 6 months of our marriage. I think she still does it once in a while, and I've done it too, so I don't blame. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and group these objects. I'll just call this plane. And I'd probably work on the sizing a little bit, but I might also want in this section here, maybe how long the flight is. Because, for some of us, it might be easy to look at 8:50 a.m. and then hop over here to 9:59 a.m. and be like, okay, well, that's like an hour and 9 minutes, right? That might be easy. But, for others, maybe not. And especially if you're flying to different states or different countries where there's a time zone involved, because usually both times are in local time. So adding the numbers just a mess, right? So it's sometimes nice just to have right below maybe 1 hour and 9 minutes, I think? 9 minutes. I'm going to center this, and for the size, I think 14 might work. Maybe I'll bump it up to bold just so it's nice and visible. How was your trip to San Francisco? It was nice. It was my first time back in our office it was like 2.5 years or something like that, which was ridiculous. If anyone has seen the concept double-decker seat design for future cabins, double-decker seat designs. Now, I've been on a double-decker plane, but I haven't seen double-decker seat designs. That does sound anxiety-inducing. Can't even say that. That's how much it's inducing. I don't know if that even makes sense. Probably not. All right. That's looking okay. I think I might want to just grab some of these objects and just move them down a little bit, right? Just so things are breathing. We don't want things too crammed, because then it's going to make reading very difficult. So we're going to keep things nice and breathable. We might go back and make some changes to that later, but I'm going to group that, and I'll just call this header. And then down below, we're going to want some additional information about this flight. Gate number, boarding time, possibly, and then seat. Mwenda says, I remember you introduced, yeah, I mean, that's I think it was last week I was recording my session for Adobe Max, and I literally mispronounced my own last name. So, Renee, it happens. Happens even to me. All right, so down here, I'm also going to add some of these character styles to my document assets. There we go. Right, so we can use some of these text layers. We can even probably duplicate this downwards, and maybe I'll just flip this over. This will be maybe our gate, and then the gate might be, I don't know, 15B, for example. And then we might want our boarding time over here. Let's go ahead and center align this. And maybe we're going to board at, let's center that as well, 8. The flight is, what time is the flight? 8:50? When would boarding be? Like 8:10, something like that? Maybe. And then over here, we're going to do our seat. And this might be, let's say 32A, which I think is the seat I was sitting in during my recent trip. All right, that could work. Beautiful. Now, one thing that I'm noticing is, I have a little bit of padding on the sides, but, this area here is a little bit too close to these cutouts. So a few things I want to do. Number one, I want to make sure to move these cutouts down a little bit so we can create a little bit of a perforation there as well. But I might also want to make them a touch smaller. So somewhere around maybe, you can also enter the values directly in here, maybe around 16 possibly. And I'll do this one. Actually, I can select all of them. 16, and then just make sure that they all line up nicely. There we go. So at this point, things are definitely coming along, right? We have some information here. We may want to separate this section here with this section that's going to go down here, which is going to be where all your accommodations are for the flight. And as I mentioned earlier, things like Wi-Fi, is there food on board? Are there restrooms? I mean, I hope there are restrooms, right? But sometimes you have to kind of spell those things out for some people because they may not know. Maybe it's their first time flying. They might not know that there's a restroom. Are there outlets? Is there TV? Things like that, right? I'm going to grab a line and all the way across. And we're going to make this line nice and subtle. So something like this. And I'm not, obviously you should worry about accessibility. But for fancy elements like, whoop, this doesn't even line up, does it? Aha, there we go. For fancy decorative elements like this, it's not the end of the world if it's a little bit, if the contrast isn't as high. But for things like the boarding information, your flight times, things like that, accessibility matters. And I'll show you that in just a moment. So maybe I will increase the dashes a little bit. I can maybe round out the caps a touch. I think I'll leave it like that. I think it looks okay, right? Maybe. Does it still not line up? Something still doesn't line up. Or is the line not? The line is not straight. That makes so much sense. Now it's straight. Now it works. Everything's great. All right. Last time I took an hour of flight, we couldn't use the ooh, Beverly. That does not sound fun. That is not fun at all. All right. So we have our little perforation. And maybe I will... There we go. So accessibility. I mentioned earlier. One thing that I use all the time is the Stark plugin. So you're definitely going to want to make sure that the majority of your content, if not all of it, passes accessibility. So if I hop down to my plugins, I do have the Stark plugin installed. You can go ahead and press the plus button right here at the top, search for Stark and install it. And at the moment, you do need a free plan. So you can sign up for a free plan to use the contrast checker. But what it's going to do is when you have an object selected, let's say this plane, it's going to look at no. Is it because it's in a large group or something? Well, what it should do, let me just select an object that's out here. Maybe it's because it's in a group or something like that. I don't know. But let me change this color here, right? So it's going to look at your selected color, and it should look at the color behind it. At the moment, it looks like there's something going on with this Stark plugin. Usually it works great, but it's looking at a purple somewhere. I don't know where this purple is, but it's supposed to look at the color behind it, and it's going to tell you if it passes accessibility, all the AAA, AA, all the fun stuff. So definitely use that plugin. I'm going to try to find out later why it's not working, but I'll figure it out. All right, now down here below, we're going to want that accommodation section. Again, Wi-Fi, food, restrooms, yada, yada, yada. Let's hop over to Nucleo. We're going to grab some icons. And I'll start with a Wi-Fi icon. We're going to keep these relatively simple because they will be on the smaller side. So I'm going to grab this icon here and paste it. And we're going to rearrange some of these in a moment. Now, if you don't have icons on in Nucleo or a third-party icon manager or on your computer, if you do go down to the plugins and you hop into the Icons for Design plugin, you can search for icons. These are all open source icons, so you can use them in your projects. Wi-Fi, and you'll find a lot of the same icons that I've been using, from Open and Iconic, Feather, Awesome. You can just click on them and it loads it into your project. Look at that. That's a decent looking icon, actually. So we'll grab that one, and we're going to want maybe food. That could potentially work, right? And then maybe restrooms, maybe a toilet. Oh, there you go. Toilet paper, toilet. One of those is bound to work. It's so interesting how, even though technically all these icons are the same height, looking at them, this Wi-Fi icon looks drastically larger than these other icons, just because some of the elements are a bit smaller. This food icon, the straw at the top is definitely throwing things off a little bit. So, visual centering and visual size definitely matters sometimes. Sometimes you have to break the bounds and just, increase the size of some things a little bit. Oh, Martin, there you go. I struggle with sizing issue of icons all the time. Isn't it weird? It's such a strange thing. And if I make this the same size as this, then it looks a lot larger. Like, sometimes I'm working on things and it's just like, I'm just not I just don't want to do this anymore. I don't want us to resize icons, right? It's such a strange thing. And then this icon is just screaming at me, probably because nothing else lines up properly. There you go. The life of a designer. All right, there we go. So we have some icons, and let me just resize them to the best of my ability at the moment. It just looks... Now, thankfully, these icons will be spread out. So, you know, when they're right beside each other, it's definitely gonna, and I'm gonna resize these a little bit. But when they're spread out, you have a little bit more room for flexibility. But, you know, so here, we're gonna go ahead and type out Wi-Fi. Because in addition to our icon, we also wanna make sure that if someone doesn't know what an icon means, like maybe someone looks at this icon and they might assume without any text that this indicates that there will be screaming people on the airplane, right? Because it kind of looks like a screaming face. But if you write the word outlet underneath it, and of course, if it's localized in whatever country or for, you know, whatever language the user has their application set to, then it helps tremendously, right? So Wi-Fi, I'm also going to make these icons this color here. And then we've got food. And as I'm doing this, I'll probably start grouping these icons as well. Now this is another interesting thing, right? Depending on where your users are, and this could change based on their location, right? You can have the same application, but the terminology is going to change. You know, some countries call it restrooms, some are washrooms, some call them toilets. There's all sorts of different lavatories, there's all sorts of different terms, and you also have to be sensitive based on where your target audience is. So it's another, you know, part of the user experience is making sure your copy is accurate and won't offend anybody. Now, you know, this calling it restroom, you know, might not offend somebody, but they might not be used to the word restroom. Like, what is that? Am I going to go in there and just rest, right? It's a toilet, especially in places like Japan. They're toilets, right? Let's make this a bit smaller so he's not screaming too much. And this is going to be outlets. Martin is saying maybe bringing the ripples of the Wi-Fi icon could help. Bringing in. You could be right. Yeah, there's a lot of small tweaks you can probably do to some of these icons. I want to see what it looks like when I start spreading out these icons. And then we're going to see what changes we have to make. So I'm going to go ahead and group these. I will group these. There we go. Now I'm going to move the Wi-Fi icon over to the left to snap to the gate. I'm going to move the TV icon over to the right, and then I'm going to go ahead and select all of these. And then up at the top, we have our alignment and distribution options. So I'm going to make sure that they are distributed horizontally. And then we can go ahead and launch the preview. I mean, they're not terrible, right? But something is definitely, I think that food icon in particular, you know, that smaller hamburger over to the left is definitely throwing it off. Martin is saying, another idea for the icons, replace them with dollar bills. I mean, basically, right? Because Wi-Fi, food, I'm surprised they don't charge for restrooms on flights. Let me go over to Nucleo, see if there's a better icon for food. I think this is the one I was using in my other design. Woo, large. Thank you, Laura, for explaining all the AAA and AA. I mean, even this icon, right? It has the steam kind of coming out of it, which throws it off again. So what exactly do you line up, right? Let me bring up my guides. So here's Wi-Fi, right? Do you shrink it down and line up the steam with the Wi-Fi, the top of the Wi-Fi, or do you line up this thing, I don't know if it's an egg or whatever it might be, or do you line up the bowl? Now that's probably too big, but probably, you know, something like this might work. that's looking a little bit better, right? We have our restroom icon, also too large. But now is it too small? See what we go through? Okay, I think that could work. I'd probably also bring the text down a little bit, but I think we're gonna leave it at this. We're gonna see where this takes us. I'm gonna make sure to group these icons. Command and Control G, I'm gonna call this icons just for the sake of time. And then I can also enable a stack over to the right-hand side, which will allow me to dive in here and swap the position. Because you might be working with a team of people who have certain priorities for things like this. They may want, for whatever reason, the restrooms to be at the front, or they may want the food to be at the end. Don't know their reasoning, but stakeholders and project managers, they all have reasonings for things typically. So it's always a good idea to just turn a stack on, rearrange some things if you need to. All right. Now down here, I do want to drag this down a little bit so we have some space. And then we're also I'm going to grab this area here. It makes it a little bit larger because at the bottom here is where we're going to have our barcode or QR code. But before we wrap things up, I do want to add, maybe a button or two down at the bottom. And this will allow you to something like change your flights or, add to your Apple Wallet, for example. And for things like that, specifically a button to add to your Apple Wallet, I would definitely go to Apple's iOS guidelines. And Google has the same thing for Android. They often have buttons, very, approved buttons that you'll definitely want to be able to use in your projects, right? I should also add this to my colors. There we go. Now, what you're noticing here, it's interesting, right? The purple that I'm using up here looks not too bad, but when it's on a darker background, it looks a little bit, I don't know, it just looks a little bit off, right? And I talk about this a lot, is when you're using very vibrant colors on a dark background, they tend to either get a bit muddy or sometimes they vibrate, not physically, but it just kind of looks like they're vibrating. So sometimes just bringing out the saturation just a little bit can make that color a little bit more pleasing on the eye than the vibrant color, right? Now, the question at this point is, do you update all the colors, because this is the primary color of this particular application, or do you update just this button, right? More things to think about. I would probably err on the side of updating all the colors just to make them all consistent, but definitely things to think about. Change your flight, and we're going to definitely make sure that this is white. And I might want to maybe drop down the weight to maybe medium, and let's try about 18. Maybe I'll switch back over to, that's a little bit better. Now, knowing I'm going to probably be using this particular button, in various places throughout this application, I definitely want to make sure to select it and create a component from this. And this will not only allow me to create various states, like an outline state, or if this was a web app, I can do a hover state, but it also allows me to just keep this up to date on all my artboards. I can make overrides if I need to, but I'll just pop it right about here. And then, I don't have it actually I have it on this other document, but there might be something like a button to add to Apple Wallet, right? And again, definitely go to Apple's website, but it looks something like this with a little icon over to the left. All right, now we didn't get to the barcode or the QR code down here, but we did accomplish a lot today. And, in my example that I posted on Dribbble, there was a bit of a fancier background up here, but there's so much you can do with a design like this. But that's going to wrap things up for me for today. A big thank you to everyone who has tuned in. Definitely follow me on all the different platforms and stick around. Kyle T. Webster is coming up in just a few moments. And also, if you're brand new to Adobe XD, I'll be hosting the XD Daily Challenges starting next week. So stick around for that, and I will see you all next time.